Wednesday, 11th of June, Anno Domini 2025. Ben Harnwell here at the helm on Steve Bannon's War Room. Welcome, folks. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to carry on something that we launched last week. Our two guests who were here last week, Frank Walker and Jenny Holland, they're sitting by waiting to come in later as we chew over the week's most important developments in the whole arena of Christianity and the fight for the Christian faith in the public square. But my first guest today, Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, thanks for coming on the show. I first saw your writings and your analysis some 15 or so years ago, and I've been following you since then. You had some great contributions to make on Jihad Watch, which is a great website run by Robert Spencer. But in the intervening years, I know you've produced a number of books. We're going to talk about your third one in your trilogy right now. But you've also you put out stuff with the Gatestone Institute, which I also subscribe to. By the way, you've been involved with the Middle East Forum, and I think you've been a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute. So you've got a whole sackload of experience under your belt. Tell us a bit though about your new book, which is The Two Swords of Christ. I know this is the third one in your series, and the first two books have had huge resonance in our sector, in our segment here. Tell us, before you tell us about what the book's about, tell us what inspired you to write it, because I think in all three of these books there are messages to our contemporary time.
Yeah, good to be with you, Ben. Excuse me. Well, it's hard to talk about that book without talking about its predecessors, the other two, and because they all have a sort of synergistic, effect on one another. They complement one another. So just to briefly summarize, the first book, Sword and Scimitar, subtitle 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, really traces the history of conflict between Islam and the West, which, of course, is its modern term. Historically, was Christendom. And I start really from the beginning with the first, couple of years after Muhammad's lifetime, with the first battle in 636, and we fast forward all the way until America's first war as a nation, the Barbary Wars with Muslims, and I highlight the decisive battles and how they really had a tremendous impact on the shaping of the world, so that very few people know. There's an older European historian. His name is Franco Cardini, and he said very memorably that Islam was a violent midwife to Europe, because so much of what Europe really became was a byproduct of continuous aggression from surrounding Islam. And the book also shows, Sword and Scimitar, that a lot of the countries or nations or regions that we think, or a lot of people think today, have always been Muslim. The Muslim world, especially the Arab world, all of that was actually was not just Christian. It was actually the greater part of Christendom. And so Islam, I show in that book in the first few chapters how Islam just completely, in 1 century, conquered all that region from Egypt and greater Syria, the Middle East, all the way to Morocco, and then even got into Spain. So a lot of people are not aware that so much of what was once Christendom, about 66 or 70%, if you look at a map, was actually permanently swallowed up by Islam. And later by the Turks, Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today, was one of the oldest Christian regions. Epistles are in there. Book of Revelation talks about its cities. So anyway, that's Sword and Scimitar. Defenders of the West was sort of similar, but it was more biographies. I chose 8 biographies of 8 men who I identify as defenders of Christendom vis-a-vis Islam, and it also moves chronologically. And I know a lot of people find that very inspiring, and that's partially why I also wanted to write it. It's sort of it's the same theme, but now I'm really like zooming in on the lives of specific men, kings and warriors and emperors who, took the cause. And the newest book now, The Two Swords of Christ, is I originally conceived it as a book about the military orders, and but eventually it just became about the two primary ones, really, who spearheaded the defense of Christendom, which would be the Knights of the Temple and the Knights of the Hospital, or the Templars and Hospitallers, respectively. And that, I think, the relevance of that book, well, what it is just, it's a history. Again, it's a history of those, how they came into being, how the military orders came into being, the rationale behind them, and I think that's very important. And in fact, that's the title of the book. Two Swords of Christ is a reference to the passage in Luke where Christ says, sell your garment and buy a sword. And his disciples say, look, Lord, here are two swords. And he says, that is enough. Now, even though that verse has been allegorized into absolute meaninglessness today, it actually meant something to pre-modern and especially medieval Christians. And what it meant is there's two sorts of evil, and you have two kinds of swords to fight against them. You have a secular sword against physical evil, and you have a spiritual sword against spiritual evil. So modern-day Christians only believe in the latter one, apparently, and they've completely lost focus on the former, which is a physical sword. So we get into the theology of how they came to rise to power, and you find it amazing. Again, today, in our modern Christian Western climate, to be a Christian is, to be passive and to be tolerant and, to be a doormat in many ways. But these guys who were essentially monks and really lived very pious lives were also very violent men. And so, reconciling the twain seems to be odd. And I think it's very fascinating when you understand the sort of theological understanding that they had. And another thing that medieval Christians did that modern day, Go ahead. Sorry,
Raymond. I'm going to go into this because we have a few minutes to break this down in a bit more detail as we go on in the show. But first of all, I want to ask you: is it your thesis then that from when Muhammad first appeared in the 6th century, right? In the late 5th century,
7th century,
6th century. Is it your thesis that there has basically been a continuous physical battle, and you can also argue a spiritual battle vis-a-vis Christianity and Islam all throughout this period, and that battle is still taking place in the present day? Or is it your thesis that talking about the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, these things are really these are historically battles that belonged in the past?
No, it's the former. It's a continuous war. So historically, again, Sword and Scimitar is the book that does this. Historically, it shows you that the war was nonstop. Of course, I mean, when we're talking 14 centuries, there's going to be times of peace because of whatever reason, and then there's truces, et cetera, et cetera. But the general hostility was constant, an overall. You remember, Islam, Muhammad is 7th century, dies at 632. And in the 16th century, in the 1500s, you have Muslims going to Iceland and Denmark to raid, and England to raid slaves under the same exact logic that the Quran tells us you're an infidel, a kafir, etc. However, having said that, what I would contend is that what's happening is the same hostility has gone on, except it's taken different manifestations and different guises. And it's continuous. The continuum from the Muslim side is unwavering. The problem is the discontinuity of the West. In other words, and this is why it's good and timely to read about men like these knights, and how they perceived this war, which was both physical and spiritual in their mind, hence the two swords. But now, it's taken forms. Islam is so weak, and, the forebears of Europe and the Western Christians would be turning in their graves to see that finally, the West is supreme, more powerful technologically, economically, militarily. And it's still suffering worse than when you keep in mind during these centuries of the long war between Islam and the West, Europe was the underdog. That was the weak one. That was the one who was being battered and was like really until, maybe 17th century and so forth, or 16th century. So now, though, you got the same hostility. So let's say Europe brings in all these, the demographic change, and they're bringing millions of migrants from the Muslim world. And lo and behold, they're doing the same sorts of things that they did when they used to invade Europe with the sword. But now they're being welcomed in. So, it's the same kind of thing that's going on. Churches all throughout Europe and in Western countries are constantly being attacked and desecrated. Crosses are being broken. And so to me, it's a pattern of unwavering hostility that goes all the way back to the 7th century. But because the West has kind of distanced itself from its own heritage and, broken away from Christendom and that idea, it doesn't see it. It doesn't understand it. It's working under this guise of multiculturalism, and any problem that goes on, it has to do with economics or grievances, and so they don't understand the sort of existential hostility that has been just unwavering and as I document in my books. Hasn't stopped, and it's still going on.
What about this thesis that you'll find pretty much in most of the media and modern academia, that here were these peaceable Muslims just getting on with their life, and you have the brutality of Christians in the Crusades going in and for no reason whatsoever attacking, because the Christians are the bad guys, the Muslims are the good guys. That's basically the modern perception, the narrative that you'll pick up here in the West. Well, what's your reading on that? And is your book in some ways a corrective to that alternative history, that fake history?
Exactly. In regards to the latter point, exactly. The reason I wrote these books, this trilogy, essentially is as a corrective to that narrative. And you're also right. That is the predominant narrative. It's what I call fake history. And as I often say, fake history is much more dangerous than fake news because it creates overarching narratives and paradigms that people sift current events through. So if you believe what you just said, not you, but people in general, and they do, that, medieval Christians and Crusaders were the aggressors, Muslims were peaceful, tolerant victims. If you believe that, of course, then you fast forward and you look at events today. And I mean, a few years ago, I think like thousands of Germans did a march to the Holy Land wearing shirts with Arabic. It said, "I'm sorry," for the Crusades. Okay. So it puts you in this position where you feel like you have to make concessions because you're the bad guy. Let's make up for what our ancestors did. Let's now like turn a new leaf and let's give Muslims the benefit of the doubt, et cetera, et cetera. But if you actually, and it's so diabolical the way that this fake history, because I've really read a lot of books written by secondary historians who are supposed to be well renowned, and the things they say, it's just, I'll give you one example of well-known professor John Esposito from Georgetown University, which is where I attended for a while. And, he's the editor-in-chief of Oxford Books on Islam, and he's written so many books published by the Oxford University Press. And he literally says in one of his books, I think it's called Islam, the Straight Path, he says 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians elapsed before an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars that have left an enduring legacy of mistrust. In other words, Muslims and Christians just got along hunky-dory for 5 centuries until the First Crusade in 1095, when these evil imperialistic, papal power play popes and Catholics decided to go and attack innocent Muslims. The reality, as I sort of alluded earlier, is the complete opposite. In those 5 centuries, Islam destroyed and wreaked havoc all throughout Christendom. In 1 year alone, according to a Muslim historian, in the year 1009, the Caliph, the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt, Hakim Ba'amr Allah, according to Muslim historian Al-Makrizi, destroyed 30,000 churches in Greater Syria and Egypt, including the Holy Sepulchre, which he razed to the ground. So, and this is during the 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence. So even leading up to the First Crusade, the mass havoc and the massacres that the Turks were causing in Asia Minor and attacks and rapes on nuns who were going on pilgrimage, that's exactly what the Christians spoke about at Clermont, at the Council of Clermont with Pope Urban II. It was to redress and defend Christendom from what was happening. But that has been so expunged today, and it starts off like I just told you with that quote. And the same page that John Esposito, where he says 5 centuries of peace, he also says, he mockingly dismisses the fact that when the Crusaders said Deus vult, God wills it, he writes, God may have willed it, but there's no evidence that the Christians in the Holy Land willed it. Well, all contraire, and as I showed in a recent article and video, there's copious evidence of Middle Eastern Christians, Syriac, Armenian, who when the Crusaders came, they just threw themselves and kissed their feet because they helped, alleviate what was happening to them, which was mass persecution by Muslims. So yeah, this is a potent fake history that's meant to demonize Christians and demonize especially medieval Christianity. I think there's a force out there that is very scared that Western Christian men might start sort of gravitating and find appealing medieval Christian men, specifically the two knight groups that I spoke about in the Two Swords of Christ, the Knights of the Temple and Hospital.
Tell me something, Raymond. What do you think about the Catholic Church in the decades following the Second Vatican Council? Has it had a role to play in trying to present the truth behind the defense of Christians in the Middle East under Islamic conquest, or has it, do you think, rather somewhat sold the pass behind a deceptively dialogue-based interaction with Islam? Could it have done more? And are you looking towards the new Pope Leo the 14th to change the position somewhat from the position of Pope Francis and his numerous declarations, like I think it was Abu Dhabi, his declaration with regards to Islam. So there's two questions there. Do you think the Catholic Church has done enough in presenting to Catholics the truth about the Islamic conquest of Christendom in the previous centuries? And are you looking and hoping for a change under the new Pope?
Yeah, as far as the first question, no, it has not done enough, especially under Pope Francis. He was much more, it seems, interested in just dialogue and trying to show, some fraternal, peaceful overtures towards the Islamic world. And he did a lot of these meetings with the Grand Imam of Egypt, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib. And it's just, as a person like me who watches and reads in Arabic, and I get to watch the Sheikh. So I would watch Pope Francis and the Sheikh talking and hugging each other and kissing each other and talking about peace and love and how Muslims and Christians are, brother religions and should help each other. And then I would watch the Sheikh speaking in Arabic, saying the exact opposite and sounding not unlike ISIS. When it comes to the Christian is the kafir, the infidel, we can't have churches and all that sort of thing. But of course, he doesn't speak it the way ISIS does. He tries to be a little more diplomatic, but it's the same mentality. And Al-Azhar, which is almost like the equivalent of the Vatican, people will say, of the Islamic world, is notorious for publishing books that what we would call radical Islam. And they have no choice because those are the books of Islam, the Hadith and the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad, and all the special studies. So it's a one-sided thing, and and a lot of the Muslims, and when Christians from the Middle East watch this, they can't believe it because he's being so hoodwinked, Pope Francis. Unless, of course, he knew that, and it doesn't matter because he just wants to put a show of, hey, we're signing all these. Excuse me.
Let me just stop you there. What's your reading of the situation? Because no one follows these things more attentively than you. Do you think he was acting? Do you think Bergoglio was acting in good faith, or do you think he was actually acting in bad faith with his presentation to Catholics that Islam is a peaceful religion?
The only way to answer that question is, how, what's his intelligence level? Did he really believe what he was saying, or is he that naive, or was this wishful thinking, or is this just, like I said, kind of a show? I think it's a little bit of all. It's a combination. He's hoping, but he also knows probably not. Especially when people like me would expose what his counterpart would say and do soon thereafter, after these meetings. But as far as, and he would, for example, write encyclicals about the environment. But it's like you could have written an encyclical about the fact that something like, I think the latest estimate published by the human rights group Open Doors on their world watch list is, I don't know, like 400 million Christians around the world are being persecuted. And some of them really graphically. In Nigeria, you have 2 Christians being killed every hour, for their faith. So you would think as the Pope, and here's the irony, when you go back and you study the history, and as I show in these books, the men who spearheaded the Crusades were the popes. These were the guys who were the most, stalwart resistors against Islamic violence and the spread of Islam. And so it's funny now when you fast forward to a Pope Francis and they come off, so wishy-washy. As far as the new Pope, I think one can have some hope. But in the end, I just feel
swollen legs aren't the problem. They might be edema symptoms. What looks like just puffy, tired legs might be something deeper. Edema happens when the body's drainage system, the lymph, slows down. And when it does, fluid has nowhere to go. You can prop your legs up, cut the salt, walk more. If the system underneath isn't moving, the swelling stays. Edema isn't just about what you see. It's about what's happening under the surface. And your body wants you to notice. You don't need extreme solutions. There are natural ways to support that system. Start by understanding how it really works. Watch the video below. Know what your body's actually telling you.
All it takes is one click on the link below.
these institutions are just being such big, vast institutions, they can't help but have to be diplomatic. So there's probably only so much he will say or do, though I think he understands the situation better. He's already talked about, I don't remember the exact details, but you've already referenced that Christians are being persecuted. So that's a good sign. We just need, it would be nice for popes to go back to how they used to be in a way, when they were the chief defenders of the faith.
It would indeed be nice to go back to the way things used to be when popes were Catholic. Look, we've got a break coming up in 5 minutes. There is a story that I wanted to quickly hit with you, but I think we'll hold it over now until after the break. One thing I did want to ask you, however, listening to you talk, is that it's conscious to me that that guys, males, if you will, are having a moment. You've got this whole thing in social media about the Manosphere. And as I was sort of listening to you talking about this muscular form of Christianity that we saw in the past, and I know you elsewhere you've described Templars and Hospitallers as not as soldiers and not as cloistered monks, but both together at the same time. Given that chaps have really had a back seat in the Catholic Church following the Second Vatican Council, and there is a moment taking place now within this wider Manosphere concept. Just tell me something about your reading of the situation. Is there anything that is going, that, in the books, these 3 books, but specifically the Two Swords of Christ, that speaks to this contemporary dynamic, specifically about men leading up and taking leadership roles within the church once again?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points that comes out in this history, the Two Swords of Christ, about the knights. It's this fusion of piety and militancy, which is so alien, to your modern day Christian who has just been bred into becoming a doormat. They've taken the whole idea, this turn the other cheek has been so, I think, weaponized by people who actually hate Christianity. And at the same time, I often wonder to myself, are people, men especially, are they overly fond of boasting that they're turning the other cheek because Jesus commanded them to, or is the first premise that they're really cowards and they found a pious pretext to hide behind, which is, I don't want to be confrontational, I don't want to be judgmental, I don't want to do anything, and because Jesus told me to. I'm starting to think that's really what's going on, and that they've been bred to become so passive, so cowardly. A lot of men in the West, and obviously I'm generalizing, and a lot of men are not like that in the West, obviously. But I think it's been weaponized, this passive side of, if you go back in pre-modern time, even though it seems so taken for granted today that Christianity is passive and peaceful and does nothing, no one thought that way, so this is a new idea that was really been, it's a classic heresy, right? A heresy is you take one aspect of religion and you blow it out of proportion and you ignore all the rest. Where's the aspect of, overturning tables and a whip of cords and driving people out due to righteous indignation? Where do you get that? It's missing. And it wasn't missing for pre-modern men, for medieval men. It was very much, there was no conflict whatsoever between loving your neighbor and fighting and defending them and killing. When you think about it, both the Knights of the Temple and the Knights of the Hospital, they began in their origin of just wanting to help their fellow man. They were working on the verse, loving your fellow man as you love yourself, and loving God. That's what led to the Crusades. But so the Templars, because when Christians would go on pilgrimages after the First Crusade, and now Jerusalem's under Crusader control, they were still being killed and attacked by Muslims. So in their origin, the Templars were just basically a vanguard to protect pilgrims. And then the Hospitallers is even more telling, because these were actually the men who were like a care worker. People who would come, and it was a hospice, and they would care for them, and they would wash them and feed them and clothe them, and these are the guys who became militant and violent, because to them in the end it was, why am I going to sit in the hospital and wait until you get attacked by Muslims and then try to resuscitate you? Why don't I actually go and prevent it, preemptive strike, by protecting you? So it's amazing that, but for us today, and this is why you don't hear about these knights, and the Templars have been so demonized and they've been turned into something that doesn't even exist, told pure mythology. And I think it's because if you really study them, they are appealing to Christian masculinity. And that's why there's a concerted effort to keep them suppressed or to demonize them or to turn them into all the nonsense that they've been turned into. Yeah.
Which ironically isn't a problem that exists within the Islamic world. Far from it. Ironically, it's interesting that what you mentioned, and I hadn't considered that before, that basically the beta male mentality can hide behind the precepts of our Lord and present themselves as sort of a prudential form of interior spirituality, when in fact it's just plain up in your face cowardice, right?
Yeah. They're making a virtue out of a vice. Okay, it's cowardice, and they hide behind because think about it. Non-confrontationalism, non-judgmentalism, being tolerant of everything. Well, that's the easy route. That's the easy thing to do because you never get in anyone's face. You never resist. So I think a lot of people have adopted that, and that comes first. That's the first premise, and then the second premise is what Jesus said. So it's instead of what it should be is that you want to do right, and if someone strikes you, you want to actually kill them, but you don't. You control yourself. That's how it should be. All right, and that's what Jesus, I believe, was. And keep in mind, everyone knows this turn the other cheek business. The one verse Jesus actually gets slapped in the Gospels, and he didn't turn his other cheek. He actually challenged the man. So clearly this is a very symbolic thing to say, and it should never in any way, shape, or form be actually practiced. And no one did because they had just war.
We heard from Frank Walker about the procession, the pilgrimage in Chartres, you saw the bishops there trying to stamp down on the very thing that young people are thirsting for. You heard what Jenny Holland was just saying, she's not a Catholic, not a believer, but she's saying the same thing again and again of people searching for the sacred, for the transcendent. How do you tie this in, all these themes that we've been discussing about on the show? Tell me about this article in the Washington Post specifically about the numbers and how things are going, and obviously with the narrative of what you're talking about of this 1,500, 1,600 year battle vis-a-vis Christianity and Islam. What are the numbers like? What are the dynamics taking place in the West today, in the world today?
Yeah, so as I had indicated, the jihad and the crusade, which went on for centuries until recently, the jihad continues, but there is, of course, absolutely no crusade. It's taken different guises, and one of them, of course, is this demographic jihad. They actually call that. It's called that. Remember, the word jihad, apologists will tell you, it doesn't mean holy war. It means struggle, strive. It does, and that makes it even more dangerous because historically, the only way you were going to struggle and strive against Christians was through force, because they weren't going to give up or betray their heritage and their faith just for fun, like they are today. But it also meant strive in different ways. You can strive with your money. You can fund the jihad, strive by propaganda or lying. Then there's the baby jihad, which is they actually encourage Muslims, men and women, to keep procreating children. And you go now into Europe, and almost every large Western city, Oslo, there's so many of them. I wrote about them, maybe 4 or 5 capitals, and the number one name of newborn baby boys is Muhammad. And there's a reason for that. The parents are making a point, okay, that they're choosing that name of all names. It's not just like any Arabic name. So there's definitely just the numbers are growing, and that's why when you look at certain areas in Europe, like in Sweden or in the UK, Germany, of course, France, you have what you're seeing, which is a lot of these Muslims are growing in numbers, and Europeans are not replacing themselves, as we know. There's a decline in the birth rate. And if you look at certain polls, I remember a Pew one, I think it says in Germany, something like by 2050, Muslims are going to be, I don't know, maybe like 40%. And I mean, it's over, game over at that point. If 20% is even enough, especially if you go back to the idea of all these cowardly people who think, are making a virtue of a vice by not resisting and not doing anything. 20% is plenty. So yeah, the jihad continues, unabated, and it's taken different forms. And now one of them, the main one, is this sort of baby demographic explosion. And at the same time as that report indicates, Christianity is seeing a sort of withdrawal. And I think a lot of that is because modern day Western Christianity is just not appealing. It's become such an abstract idea. It's been stripped of everything, stripped of all sort of concrete. A ritual is one aspect, but even more than ritual, it's stripped of history. And it's just an idea, John 3:16, that's it. And now I live my life like a secular person. So no wonder churches are, declining and falling away, because we need a more robust historic form of Christianity. That is what appealed to people. That's what men fought and died for, as in those books, the two swords of Christ. And they're not going to do it for what's now being paraded as Christianity, which is as I said, just a mask for craven behavior, essentially. Yeah.
This is something that we've said on the show time and time again, that coherence in religion is extremely compelling, and that's true whatever the religion is, right? And this is one of the reasons that we find today this curious phenomenon that a false religion is in a far stronger, numerically, arithmetically, in terms of momentum. You mentioned, I think, the word demographic jihad. A false religion is in a far stronger position than the true faith. Let me just quote this thing here, because I have the figures right in front of me. And this is the Washington Post. It says that Christianity's share of world population decreased by 1.8 percentage points to 28.8%. And it says here, this is I'm quoting the Washington Post, the fall off is driven in large part by disaffiliation. I think Frank Walker and I, we could spend a whole hour talking over exactly what that means. Is it the Muslim population, on the other hand, increased by 1.8 percentage points to 25.6. Okay, so I think that's really all we have time for. Raymond Ibrahim, very, very honoured and grateful for you to come on the show today. Just very briefly, where do people go to get not only the Two Swords of Christ, but the previous two books as well in the trilogy?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. You can order it in a lot of places online, but the easiest place probably is Amazon. They're all available. Sword and Scimitar, Defenders of the West. The new book is actually not published yet, but you can pre-order it. And like I said, but and they all stand alone. You don't have to read them to understand them, but they do complement each other because they're kind of different lens on different kind of aspects of the Crusades and these long wars with Islam. But yeah, Amazon, you can probably order all of them right now. And
on X?
Yeah, I'm on X, and I also started a new YouTube channel. I invite everyone to check it out. It's called the Holy War Channel, where I discuss all these topics and more. So that's fun too.
What's your handle on X? Where do people go?
Actually, the best place is just go to my website, RaymondIbrahim.com.
Okay.
And everything's there. You'll find links to my X, links to my Facebook, even though I'm shadow banned there. So even if you follow me there, but and also to the YouTube stuff, as well as links to the books on Amazon.
Raymond Ibrahim, thank you very much for coming on the show. We'll catch up again with you soon.